Hello, I'm Hazem Seeker. This is Counting the Cost on Al Jazeera, your weekly look at the world of business and economics. This week, Venezuela in default as the oil-rich country fails to pay its debt. We'll look at what happens next and what it means for its people. Also this week, caught in the middle of a bitter Saudi-Iran rivalry, Lebanon's economy getting squeezed, why that matters for the region. A military intervention in Zimbabwe, but will anything really change for the country's ailing economy? So, oil-rich Venezuela always pays its debts, even at the expense of its citizens. That's been the mantra for so long in this Latin American country that lenders have just kept lending. But this week, everything changed. Venezuela is now officially in default. For the first time, it's passed a grace period to pay up on 2 government bonds and 1 bond issued by the state-owned oil company. Now, as more payments are due, it is facing what could be a messy financial unravelling. And that spells bad news for its starving population. John Hendren reports.
Venezuela is in default. The declaration by the ratings agency Standard & Poor's comes after Venezuela, with $60 billion in debt and just $9.6 billion in its bank accounts, missed a second deadline on a debt payment. The red carpet was rolled out for a few foreign investors who might be willing to keep the country afloat at a price. Venezuela's vice president, Tariq al-Assimi, said the country is the victim of an economic war being waged by the U.S. and foreign lenders.
This assault of the U.S. government is made jointly with the Venezuelan opposition. Today, Venezuela is limited to seek financing, finding ourselves faced with the need to consider new formulas to get out of this complexity.
Critics say Venezuela's leaders have prioritized clearing debt over a growing humanitarian crisis that has left many of its people hungry and children dying in hospitals with medical shortages. Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro blames the U.S. for his country's crisis, so he's turning to his traditional rivals.
The
international agreements with the People's Republic of China are working perfectly and will continue to go that way. I can announce that we have reached a renegotiation and refinancing agreement with the Russian Federation.
In spite of President Maduro's plans, U.S. firms still own much of Venezuela's debt, and the Trump administration, wary of providing an economic lifeline to his administration, has blocked Americans from participating in any debt restructuring talks. With diminishing cash revenues, Venezuela's financial problems are likely to get even worse.
Joining us now from London is Edward Glossop, an emerging markets economist at Capital Economics, specializing in Latin America. Good to have you with us. So where do you think this is going to go with Venezuela? What's likely to happen next?
Well, that's the million-dollar question. The government has announced that they want to restructure all of their external debt. That includes bond debt and debts owed to countries such as China and Russia. Where we go from here is anyone's guess, really. The restructuring talks, in our opinion, look doomed to fail, and it seems only a matter of time before the government and the state-owned oil company outright defaults on all of its external debt.
Yeah, so what does this mean for the oil markets then? I mean, given that oil is fundamental to Venezuela's economy, is that going to be one of the state-owned assets that's in focus here that could be up for grabs if there is a wider default?
Absolutely, yeah. So that's a key risk, that this is what's prevented the government from defaulting so far, is that creditors can now seize, or once the government and PDVSA defaults on their bond debt, the creditors can seize oil exports or attempt to seize oil exports and really cut off Venezuela's access to dollar oil revenues completely, which would, in our view, trigger complete meltdown and a political crisis.
And how much room do they have to maneuver with the continued U.S. sanctions on Venezuela? How is that hampering them?
Very little. Exactly. This is one of the key reasons, the key hurdles for the restructuring. So the U.S. financial sanctions prevent U.S. investors from participating in any restructuring or refinancing deal. So that's one of the huge hurdles facing the current restructuring. That's one of the key reasons why we think the restructuring and refinancing is likely to fail in the current environment.
But just taking a step back for a moment, how did things get so bad in Venezuela that we're talking about the country defaulting now? I mean, obviously, oil prices, the fall in oil prices had an effect. But is this also down to bad government policy as well?
Absolutely. Yeah, this crisis is the proximate cause of the crisis was the fall in oil prices, but this crisis has been brewing for decades now. Even under Chavez, where there were huge nationalizations, huge underinvestment in the oil sector over a number of decades, because of course it has the biggest oil reserves in the world. Huge underinvestment in the sector has caused oil output to be in a long-term decline, and so its oil revenues have been falling sharply for a number of years now. And of course the drop in oil prices in mid-2014 has exacerbated the crisis, and this is ultimately why we are now in a default scenario. We're now in the end game.
But what about Venezuelans themselves? I mean, they're already suffering greatly under this, with all of the shortages and the surge in prices and so on. What's the effect on them going to be as the longer this goes on, and the implications of the default?
Absolutely. I think the key question here is what happens to oil export revenues. If a default triggers seizures of oil exports, then that causes a huge drop-off in oil exports. Oil export revenues are completely collapsed. And then that means that the government can't afford to import the goods that it needs in order to stave off an even deeper humanitarian crisis. So the key issue is whether the government can keep control of export revenues. So far, it looks like the government is trying to keep hold of these export revenues by trying to negotiate some sort of deal with bondholders such that it can keep control of the export revenues, because that's ultimately the key to avoiding an even more dramatic humanitarian crisis and ultimately a political transition in power.
Good to speak with you, Edward Glossop, joining us there from London. Thank you. Now, the dire state of finances in Venezuela and Zimbabwe is making Bitcoin more attractive for many people in both countries. The price of the cryptocurrency jumped as much as 10% on Zimbabwe's Golex exchange on Wednesday after the country's army seized power. Zimbabweans, just like Venezuelans, are buying things they think might retain value. Let's take a look at how bad things have gotten in Zimbabwe after nearly 40 years of Robert Mugabe. In November 2008, Zimbabwe had the second highest recorded inflation rate in history. Prices were doubling every 24 hours, with the official rate at one point hitting 79 billion%. The following year, Zimbabwe was forced to abandon its currency. Zimbabweans mainly use the US dollar now, but things haven't been improving. Mismanagement has hit farming and mining production. Unemployment is near 90%. So without enough exports to earn foreign currency, there's a cash crunch. Sleeping outside the bank is the only way some Zimbabweans can make sure they get their money. And now fears are growing the system doesn't have enough cash. Money stored electronically in bank accounts is nicknamed Zolas. In the absence of hard currency, people are trying to convert Zolas into assets that can retain value: cars, property, and even digital currencies. The economy is broken despite the fact that Zimbabwe was once known as the breadbasket of Africa and is still rich in resources like platinum, gold, diamonds, and nickel. Well, joining us via Skype from Cape Town is Elisa Strobel, senior economist at IHS Markit. Thanks for being with us. So if this is the end of the Mugabe era in Zimbabwe, what potential is there for the next leader to turn things around? Because, as we said, this is a country that is still rich in natural resources.
Years of poor governance, controversial economic policy, corruption, confusion, and lack of political direction, and unity within the governing party and non-commitment towards interests of foreign investors have devastated the country's economy, experiencing currently a severe liquidity crisis.
Where does Bitcoin fit into all of this? I mean, how bad have things gotten that people are now turning to Bitcoin as an investment?
Demand for Bitcoin surged immensely this morning, like I've mentioned, at the Golex, the local Bitcoin exchange. The elevated Bitcoins, we think, the prices we see in Zimbabwe are certainly evidence of the country's broken economy. It is estimated that the Bitcoin traded above a 85% premium yesterday. Critically, currently demand for Bitcoin in Zimbabwe exceeds supply, as Bitcoin mining, according to Golix, the exchange platform, requires large amount of electricity, a challenge in a country that has severe electricity supply shortages. However, we need not to forget that the majority of population works in the informal sector. Locals who want to pay electronically still face some challenges when buying items from those working in the informal sector. The crisis and the need for hard cash has therefore forced many into the black market, where dealers are trading the dollar for electronic dollars, as mentioned, as a very high rate and premiums. I do believe that there are massive potential for Bitcoin, and not just in Zimbabwe, but in Africa.
What kind of leverage does the outside world have here? I mean, can it potentially help with Zimbabwe's defaulted international debts?
Firstly, with the shift in policy, which is quite necessarily foreign investment and support by the international community is necessary for the broken economy. It's very important to establish confidence in the country's banking system to deal with operational challenges and attracting investment first.
Elisa Strobel, thanks very much for being with us.
Sure, pleasure. Thank you very much.
All right, still to come on Counting the Cost. Would you eat a beef burger grown from cells in a lab? We'll take a look at what could make it onto your plates in the future. Now, it's been called the world's first digital medicine, and analysts say it could open up a new frontier in the Internet of Things. The US Food and Drug Administration just approved a digital pill. Basically, it's a sensor the size of a grain of sand. Once swallowed, it will send data to a smartphone app on when patients have taken their medication. But having your insides talk to the internet could prove a little indigestible for some. Here's Kristen Salumi.
Patients who don't take their medicine as directed not only risk their health, they cost about $100 billion a year, according to one study about avoidable costs in medicine. That's because the patients often end up sicker or needing additional treatment. Enter a new digital pill, just approved for use by the US Food and Drug Administration, in people with schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, and other forms of mental illness. It actually lets your doctor know if you've taken it.
The problem of not adhering to treatment when it's administered on a regular basis, daily, multiple times a day, and the way that compromises the effectiveness of the treatment is a huge problem in medicine, and particularly in treatment of mental disorders.
The pill's sensor is made of copper, magnesium, and silicon, ingredients already found in foods. It generates an electrical signal when it comes into contact with stomach fluids. That signal is then picked up by a wearable patch on the patient's rib cage. The patch sends the date, time, and patient activity level via Bluetooth to an app on the patient's mobile phone and a database to which researchers have access. Through the app, the patient can have a record sent of every time he or she takes the pill to up to 4 people, family members or caregivers. But the technology raises questions about privacy. Medical ethics experts find the fact that the pill is prescribed for mental illness especially troubling.
If you give someone a pill that's going to record for someone else whether they've taken the medication or not, it poses problems. These are people who may not understand all the issues because they because they have a psychiatric condition, though many people with psychiatric conditions can understand all the issues. There are problems because this may feed into their paranoia. They may think, oh my God, people want to spy on me, and now the doctor's saying he's going to give me a drug that's going to spy on me.
The cost of the drug is another concern, prompting experts to say more study will be necessary to weigh the risks versus the benefits and make this pill easier to swallow.
Now, Lebanon's economy is hurting. Growth has slowed to just over 2% a year from an average of 8% before the war in Syria. And now regional rivalries between Saudi Arabia and Iran have raised fears of a Qatar-style blockade. The resignation of Prime Minister Saad Hariri in Riyadh under mysterious circumstances has not been resolved. Just before he quit, the government had managed to pass a budget after years of political stalemate. Well, joining us now from Beirut is Sami Attallah, Director of the Lebanese Center for Policy Studies. Good to have you with us. So first off, how bad could all of this be for Lebanon's economy right now, particularly at a time when it looked like things were finally starting to pick up?
Well, indeed, this is actually might be very bad, in fact, just because Lebanon has been through many crises, some short and some long-term. But this crisis comes at the back of a protracted crisis that Lebanon has been facing since 2011 with the war in Syria, and now we're hosting 1.5 million Syrian refugees, and we have a major sort of economic problem in terms of jobs and infrastructural challenges. So this crisis, in fact, actually comes at a time where we're hoping and trying to get out of one that we're already in.
And how important is the fact that Saudi Arabia, that this is coming from Saudi Arabia, how important is that country to the Lebanese economy? Because, of course, you've got the thousands of Lebanese expat workers who work in Saudi Arabia sending money back. There's Saudi investment inside Lebanon. How important is all of that to the country?
Oh, this is very important and very significant. This is, in fact, the first time probably since or in the last 25 years that we actually face something like that, where an ally of Lebanon, Saudi Arabia, sort of may in fact impose either sanctions or affect the Lebanese expats who are actually working there. This is very significant on many levels in terms of the sending remittances to Lebanon's economy, which are deeply needed, which are important for the macroeconomic situation. They are also important for people's actually well-being here, people who actually receive these remittances. And in fact, there's a big, significant expat community in Saudi Arabia who work very hard and contribute to the Saudi economy. So if this actually escalates, this is going to be a lose-lose-lose situation. Lose for these people who are losing their jobs. It's going to be a loss for Lebanon because they're going to have to deal with more people, in fact, that are looking for jobs. And it's going to be actually also a loss for Saudi Arabia because they're actually going to be losing an important human capital, a lot of people who actually have nothing to do with the crisis in the first place.
Well, you talked there about the possibility of this escalating. How real is that possibility? Do you think that it could happen, that there could be Arab sanctions on Lebanon?
It's very hard to predict. We're not so sure to what extent this is going to escalate. You know, I think the events are unfolding on a daily basis. We're actually monitoring them to actually see if this is going to be, if there are going to be certain measures, economic measures that actually could or try to affect or influence the Lebanese government. But the big question is, if there are actually going to be any sanctions, this is going to affect Lebanon as a whole. It's going to affect the whole country. These sanctions will unlikely be able to distinguish between those who support Hezbollah and those who are not. And most people will be hurt by this, if not all. There'll be a major collateral damage. And I honestly think this is going to be bad for Lebanon, for the Lebanese people as a whole, and for the region as well. Because, in fact, impacting Lebanon's economy right now, or in fact at any time, but particularly at a very sensitive period in our region, this is really not good, frankly, policy for Lebanon or for the region. So we're really watching this very carefully. We really hope it doesn't escalate. We really hope it's actually dealt with in a very different way. And in fact, Lebanon here right now is sort of stuck between between two regional powers that actually have other objectives that they're actually trying to deal with.
But is there a way of Lebanon to get out of this by themselves? I mean, how can they take their action to grow their economy?
Well, you know, if Lebanon can take certain actions, of course, and in terms of improving its economic policies, I think we've been sort of at the center. We've been advocating for changes in industrial policy and job creation, improving infrastructure. But Lebanon does need capital. And it does have internal capital from the banking sector. And I think it actually could attract, and it does attract capital from abroad. So if left to its own devices, in the sense there are no economic sanctions on Lebanon, I think one can and see that that there will be changes in the government's policies to actually do that. And we're hoping that the new government that came into force almost or exactly a year ago, to do that. And this is what we've been advocating and pushing them to do so. Now, with the crisis looming, this actually adds another layer of challenges that are very, very significant, and it may affect the macroeconomic situation because, as you know, Lebanon does depend for a significant capital inflow coming from all over the world, particularly Lebanese expats, and particularly those that are actually living in the GCC, including Saudi Arabia. So if that's actually affected, if the remittances are actually withdrawn or are no longer actually coming in, this is a very serious issue on the macroeconomic situation. It could escalate. I don't want to sort of predict, and I don't want to sort of scare sort of people about this, but Lebanon has been able to deal with that in the short term. In fact, the short-term effect has been quite minimal, given the gravity of the political situation. But if this ends up to be a protracted crisis, where in fact sanctions are imposed or Lebanese experts are actually forced to leave the country, and this ends up to be a 2 to 3 or 4 year problem, then this is a very serious issue for Lebanon's macroeconomic situation.
Good to speak with you. Sami Atallah joining us from Lebanon. Thank you. And finally, research shows that the global meat industry produces more greenhouse gas emissions than all cars, planes, trains, and ships combined. But scientists in the Netherlands say they are close to bringing laboratory-grown meat to the market. Fleur Launsbach reports.
In the future, this is what making a beef burger might look like. Taking cells from a piece of cow and letting them multiply into cultured meat. This university professor says he can grow 10,000 kilograms of meat from just one piece of muscle. And he says we better get used to it.
That, in effect, means that we can reduce the number of cows worldwide from 1.5 billion to maybe 10,000. And then we won't have the methane emission. We won't have all the resources that go into a cow, because a cow is a terribly inefficient animal. So this process is going to be more efficient so that it uses less resources. And it's not as polluting. And you can let the cow live.
As the world's population increases, the demand on food supplies will also grow dramatically. Meat production takes up 8% of the world's water, huge amount of land, and contributes almost a fifth of the world's greenhouse gas emissions.
The average European eats about 80 kilos of meat a year. That's about 400 of these burgers. But what if, in a few years from now, a burger grown in a lab will taste exactly the same and be the exact same price as the ones here? Which one will a consumer choose?
This woman is one of the world's leading food scientists. She believes that what we might find unpalatable today might be normal for the next generation.
I mean, there are many things people have learned to eat that their grandmothers didn't eat. Certain fruits and vegetables, but also certain types of fish that people didn't know about, or snails, for example, that many people did not eat apart from the French. So I think it's a fallacy to think that food habits are immobile in time. In fact, we eat quite different things from our grandparents' generation.
Back at the burger restaurant, the manager has mixed emotions. He worries about the damage too much meat does to the planet, but he's also suspicious of the idea of eating lab meat.
Sounds a little artificial, like eating plastic or something, even though you say that they have the exact same taste. But, well, for now it's one step too far. I cannot think of me eating that. Yeah.
Science means that the cells of just one cow could provide enough meat for the whole of Europe. The first lab burgers are expected to be on the market within 3 years. But even if science could solve the massive issues caused by our meat industry, the question remains, will we eat it?
And that is our show for this week. Remember, you can get in touch with us by tweeting me at Hazim Seeker, and do use the hashtag AJCTC when you do, or drop us an email. Counting the cost at aljazeera.net is our address. And there's more for you online at aljazeera.com/CTC. That'll take you straight to our page, which has individual reports, links, and entire episodes for you to catch up on. That is it for this edition of Counting the Cost. I'm Hazim Seeker from the whole team here. Thanks for joining us. The news on Al Jazeera is next.